Welcome to the Edgar Burroughs mini podcast. My name is Tim DeForest, and this is episode number 58. And with this episode, we're going to try something a little different. We've gotten some nice feedback on the chapter-by-chapter summaries of Tarzan of the Apes and A Princess of Mars that we've done in past episodes. So I will pick another ERB novel for the same treatment before too long, though I do want to avoid repeating any books that we have covered in the full-length episodes that I do with Scott and Jess. But for now, I think it would be interesting to look back at the adventure fiction landscape as it existed when ERB was writing. What other writers were turning out stories in the same genres at the same time? And later on, we might also look back at the fiction of the 19th century to see what had influenced the adventure and science fiction tales of the 20th century. Now we're going to start with a look at The Lost World by Arthur Conan Doyle. This was serialized in the Strand magazine in 1912, and it was published as a novel the same year. This book popularized the idea of a remote location in the world where prehistoric creatures still exist. It's not necessarily the very first Lost World book, though this depends on how you define the genre. You might give that designation to Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. Or there was an 1899 short story by Warden Allen Curtis that was titled The Monster of Lake Lemaitre. Now, that story involved a lake which might contain an entrance to a hollow earth world, much like Burroughs' Pellucidor. The events of the story involved the unusual combination of a plesiosaur and a brain transplant. But Doyle's novel, at the very least, cemented the Lost World concept into popular fiction, a concept used by Burroughs in his Caspak novels, his Pellucidor novels, and the land of Pal Uldan featured in the novel Tarzan the Terrible. It also gave us one of the best fictional characters ever created, the irascible George Challenger. So let's dive into the novel. We begin with an epigraph and a short one-sentence foreword. The epigraph reads, "I have wrought my simple plan. If I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man or the man who's half a boy." So it tells us that primarily this is an adventure story, and its purpose is to entertain us and to thrill us. Doyle is reminding us here that we should never grow out of this sort of entertainment, that enjoying a well-told story and escaping into a fictional world full of adventure is appropriate for both men and boys. Now, the foreword is short but important. Mr. E.D. Malone desires to state that both the injunction for restraint and the libel action have been withdrawn unreservedly by Professor G.E. Challenger, who, being satisfied that no criticism or comment in this book is meant in an offensive spirit, has guaranteed that he will place no impediment to its publication and circulation. So, we're told that apparently, after Malone writes up the account of their adventure, Professor George Challenger objected to it and at least briefly instituted legal action to prevent its publication. And this is after sharing a dangerous adventure with Malone and the others. Challenger is still the same argumentative and difficult person that we'll meet a couple of chapters from now. This one sentence effectively foreshadows the personality of the book's most memorable protagonist. We're never told exactly what Challenger was objecting to, though I suspect it was Malone's description of the leader of the cavemen as being Challenger's near twin in appearance. We will see that Challenger found this to be extremely embarrassing. Now, in Chapter 1, the action starts off very prosaically. Edward Malone is suffering through a boring conversation with his prospective father-in-law. I think Doyle wants to stress the normality of Malone's life as a reporter in London to counterpoint this with the bizarre adventure he's soon to be embarking upon. We also meet Gladys, one of two female characters in the novel, neither of whom will go on the actual adventure. The expedition will be a boys-only affair, which is something to be expected in an Edwardian-era novel. In fact, a lot of adventure novels from this era lack important female characters. Treasure Island and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea come to mind as just two examples, though they were written about 30 years earlier. I do believe our society has become better at giving us strong female characters in popular culture. But I don't think the novels from that era necessarily suffer from not being all-inclusive. In fact, no one story is obligated to be all-inclusive. If a particular story works best with an all-male or all-female cast of characters, then that's fine. There's plenty of other storytelling opportunities for including characters in story B that don't make it into story A. Now, I'm not ignoring the fact that females and non-whites were underrepresented in the fiction of the past, or they were often portrayed as stereotypes. This is obviously true, and the sexism and racism that's a part of our cultural history needs to be acknowledged. But stories need to be examined individually. If a particular story lacks a main female character, then we must look at that story itself to see if this comes from the sexist attitudes of the day, or if there was simply no place for a main female character in that specific story. With The Lost World, the four main members of the expedition work well together, both for dramatic and sometimes comedic purposes. Doyle gives us a cast of characters that carry the story along effectively. I think we can honestly say that it does not suffer from the lack of a lady coming along. If a particular character doesn't fit into a story, then an author should not feel an obligation to hammer that character into that story no matter what. Heck, Doyle gave us Irene Adler when he needed a strong, smart woman to play a prominent role in the home story A Scandal in Bohemia. He simply didn't need a woman this time around. That being said, just about every adaptation of The Lost World has added a woman into the mix. The 1925 silent film version, for instance, had the daughter of Maple White tagging along in hopes of finding her father alive. This is a perfectly sound way of introducing a woman into the tale, and it works well in that movie. It just isn't necessary in the original novel. There was a 1998 audio adaptation of the novel that starred many veterans of the Star Trek franchise. And that one added a woman by gender-flipping Professor Summerlee, and then later having her and Malone fall in love. And though that adaptation is largely entertaining, I feel that particular decision was forced and awkward. Not because it gave us a female scientist, which is fine in of itself, but rather that the change from the original felt forced and driven by modern social concerns, rather than organic to the story. Now, it's fair to talk about what attitudes towards women were in 1912, and why none of the male characters would have considered bringing a woman along. We can then intelligently debate the right or wrong of this. But though this would be a perfectly healthy discussion in of itself, it's outside the purpose of this podcast, which is to examine the novel as an adventure story and find out why it succeeds so well on that level. Anyway, back to the novel. Malone wants to propose to Gladys, but she cuts him off. She wants to marry a man who's done something heroic. She tells him, and this is directly from the novel, there are heroisms all around us waiting to be done. It's for men to do them, and for women to reserve their love as a reward for such men. Look at the young Frenchman who went up last week in a balloon. It was blowing a gale of wind, but he was announced to go, so because he was announced to go, he insisted on starting. The wind blew him 1,500 miles in 24 hours, and he fell in the middle of Russia. That's the kind of man I mean. Think of the woman he loved, how other women must have envied her. That's what I should like to be, envied for my man. So, by golly, if Malone wants to marry Gladys, he needs to go out and do something heroic. Now that brings us to chapter 2. Malone goes to see his editor at the Daily Gazette, a man named McArdle. And by the way, though McArdle is another minor character, Doyle does a great job of sketching him out for us in the first sentence of the chapter. Quote, I always liked McArdle, that crabbed, old, round-backed, red-headed news editor, and I rather hoped that he liked me, unquote. Malone asks for some sort of dangerous mission. McArdle doesn't have anything that dangerous in hand, but he decides to have Malone expose a fraud. He wants Malone to interview Professor Challenger, the famous zoologist. Now, immediately, we get an indication that this might indeed be a dangerous mission. Malone knows Challenger's name because the hot-tempered professor had, quote, broke the skull, unquote, of a reporter of another paper. But McArdle also reads off a list of Challenger's impressive academic achievements. So we immediately know that Challenger is brilliant. But we also know that he might punch you out if he decides he doesn't like you. So take note again of how effectively Doyle is sketching out all the characters for us, both minor and major. Anyway, McArdle explains that Challenger went on an expedition to South America and came back with some damaged photographs to back up some amazing claims of what he discovered, though we as readers are not yet told what those claims are. When Malone checks with the writer of a Nature magazine for more information, Challenger's claims are referred to as rank nonsense about some queer animals he had discovered. We also get more references to Challenger's insufferable rudeness and impossible behavior. Challenger is now refusing to talk to anyone about his discoveries. So Malone decides that he needs to use a little trickery to get an appointment with Challenger. He finds the text of a speech that the professor gave in Vienna. He then writes Challenger a letter, quoting a part of that speech pretty much at random because the speech is highly technical and he actually doesn't understand a word of it. And he ends the letter with, "Have you no desire, in view of later research, to modify this statement? Do you not think that it was over-actuated?" He requests an audience with Challenger in which to discuss this. So we get an indication of Malone's cleverness and determination, as well as learning quite a bit about Challenger throughout the chapter. Doyle has moved the story along briskly, while allowing us to get to know two of the four main characters. Now in Chapter 3, Malone receives an answer from Challenger that is rather condescending, and by now we know enough about Challenger to not be surprised by that. But all the same, it does grant Malone an audience. Malone arrives at Challenger's home, first meeting Austin, a butler described as an odd, swarthy, dried-up person of uncertain age, with a dark pilot jacket and brown leather gaiters. And once again, we see Doyle's skill at giving us a solid idea of the character in a single sentence. Malone then meets a small woman we soon find out is Challenger's wife. This is the second of the two female characters in the book. And if we were going to have a female along on the expedition, I would have voted for Jessie Challenger. As we'll see in a few moments, she is simply awesome. She talks to Malone, and since he can't bring himself to tell a fib to a lady, she finds out that he's going to ask about the South American expedition. She doesn't like this. She knows it's likely to lead to another fight. She asks Malone not to question Challenger's honesty, saying, and once again, this is directly from the book, "You won't believe a word he says. I'm sure I don't wonder. But don't tell him so, for it makes him very violent. Pretend to believe him, and you may get through all right. Remember, he believes in himself. Of that you may be assured. A more honest man never lived." Now, I can't tell whether Mrs. Challenger herself is having trouble believing her husband. But by golly, I think it's obvious that she supports him and trusts his honesty, no matter how bizarre the story might be. She also adds this: "If you find him dangerous, really dangerous, ring the bell and hold him off until I come. Even at his worst, I can usually control him." And we're going to find out this is true. Even at his worst, he will pay attention to what Jessie is saying and respect that opinion, and she is the only one who can in any way or shape or form control Professor Challenger. Finally, we meet the professor. And here Doyle takes an entire paragraph to sketch out one of fiction's most enjoyable characters. And what I'm about to read is, I believe, one of the best character introductions in the history of Western fiction. He sat in a rotating chair behind a broad table, which was covered with books, maps, and diagrams. As I entered, his seat spun around to face me. His appearance made me gasp. I was prepared for something strange, but not for so overpowering a personality as this. It was his size which took one's breath away, his size and his imposing presence. His head was enormous, the largest I have ever seen upon a human being. I am sure that his top hat, had I ventured to don it, would have slipped over me entirely and rested on my shoulders. He had the face and beard which I associate with an Assyrian bull, the former florid, the latter so black as to almost have a suspicion of blue, spade-shaped and rippling down over his chest. The hair was peculiar, plastered down in front in a long, curving wisp over his massive forehead. The eyes were blue-gray under great black tufts, very clear, very critical, and very masterful. A huge spread of shoulders and a chest like a barrel were the other parts of him which appeared above the table, save for two enormous hands covered with long black hair. This, and a bellowing, roaring, rumbling voice, made up my first impression of the notorious Professor Challenger. And that introduction, I think, supports everything we've learned about Challenger and also adds to it. The book's maps and diagrams on his table highlight his academic achievements. Everything else highlights his temper and, I think, also his intelligence. We know now that he might lose his temper too quickly. He might not always express himself in a rational manner, but by golly, he's going to have the intellectual chops to back up what he says. Now, Malone tries to keep up his deception that he's there to ask about the Vienna lecture, but Challenger quickly exposes this by throwing some technobabble at the reporter. The professor begins to verbally threaten Malone, who gets his back up and tells Challenger that he won't stand for that. This leads to a fight, starting with Challenger making the first violent move. This, in turn, sends both men tumbling out of the study and then out of the front door of the Challenger home. It's a truly hilarious moment, with a policeman quickly arriving to separate them. The Bobby has dealt with Challenger before and is more than willing to arrest him for assault. But Malone here, and this is important, Malone here shows both Challenger and the readers of the novel that he has a sense of honor and honesty. He admits that the fight was his fault, and he doesn't want to press charges because of this. This impresses Challenger, impresses him enough to invite Malone back into his home. In Chapter 4, we get another hilarious moment when Challenger is confronted by his diminutive wife, who's obviously the one person in the world who doesn't take any guff from him and can get away with it. Referring to him as a great brute, she gives him a verbal tongue lashing. And even though he responds by picking her up and literally setting her on a pedestal that he calls the stool of penance, the subtext makes it clear that he would never actually hurt her, and her opinion does matter deeply to him. Doyle does an amazing bit of characterization here. The challengers are clearly arguing with one another, but we immediately sense that they are deeply in love. And this is important to us in our view of Challenger. A lot of what we've learned about him so far is clearly negative. Here we get a sense that he can show love and he can show respect. That, plus his response to Malone's honesty a few minutes before, are starting to show us that Challenger, despite his flaws, can be one of the good guys. Now, Challenger and Malone return to the study, and we find out what's what, though Malone must agree not to publish anything without Challenger's permission first. Now, as Doyle did so effectively in many Sherlock Holmes stories, he proceeds to use character dialogue to provide us with necessary background information. In the South American jungle, Challenger had found a dying man with a sketchbook. That book's most remarkable sketch is that of a stegosaurus. There's also sketches of a large plateau. Challenger manages to find this plateau, though he's unable to climb it. There is a pinnacle of rock topped by a large tree next to the plateau. Doyle establishes this now because it will be the route by which he and the other protagonists reach the top of the plateau later on. So he's putting in a sort of Chekhov's gun there. Anyway, Challenger is convinced that the artist, whose name was Maple White, did somehow get to the top, and he did see a live stegosaurus. Challenger himself finds a bone, not a fossil, that he believes to be from a dinosaur. He also gets a photograph of a pterodactyl, though this is damaged from the trip home, so he has no real proof that dinosaurs are living atop that plateau. There's only his word, and no one will believe him. Challenger is, to his credit, self-aware enough to admit that his bad temper has not helped his cause. Malone, though, is convinced of what Challenger shows him. He now thinks he's sitting on what may be the biggest story in the world. Challenger is planning on an effort to rein in his temper and attend a lecture at London's Zoological Institute. Challenger considers the man making the lecture to be a charlatan, but after the lecture is over, he plans to, quote, make it my business, with infinite tact and delicacy, to throw out a few remarks that might arouse the interest of the audience and cause some of them to desire to go much deeper into the matter. Nothing contentious, you understand, but only an indication that there are great deeps beyond. I shall hold myself strongly in leash and see whether by this self-restraint I attain a more favorable result. Now, by this point, we as readers doubt that Challenger is going to be able to hold his temper in check during this lecture. But Malone is invited to attend the lecture, so we'll soon find out. That's it for now. We will be back to cover chapters 5 through 8 soon. There are 16 chapters in the novel altogether, so I am planning on this being a 4-part series to cover the entire book. My name is Tim DeForest. Please visit my blog at Comics, Old Time Radio, and other cool stuff. You can also find links to the books I've written there. You may email us at edgarsmailbag@gmail.com or leave comments on any of the podcast or social media platforms on which we post this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Love to hear what you think of this idea for an adventure landscape series. Also in the show notes, you will find a link to our store at cafepress.com/ERB podcast, where we have lots of neat art on t-shirts, cups, and so on, with the kind permission of Edgar Burroughs Incorporated, including images directly from Burroughs' novels. So thank you. I will be back soon.